Welcome in, everyone, to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, Tommy Brzee. It is May 1st, and we have a great show for you today. We're going to start talking a little bit about the revenue sharing agreement that could be coming to the Big Ten and the SEC, break that down a little bit. We've talked about it a little bit, but definitely gaining some traction over there in those two conferences. Then we'll talk about UAB football, They joined a players association, so the very first college football team to join a players association. Kind of want to break down what that means and what the future of that might look like. And then we'll get a little bit of a transfer portal update in there for you. The portal just closed for everyone that is not a graduate transfer. They still have until, I believe, at midnight tonight to join, but it is closed for everyone else, so I want to break down who all is in as of right now and where some of the guys are leaning, and then we'll finish it off with a Spotlight Wednesday, and we'll talk about the Nebraska Cornhuskers. A ton going into this season. Dylan Raiola obviously coming over is a huge deal over there, and he had a great day on Saturday in their spring game. So we'll break down everything around the Cornhuskers, but before we jump in, I do want to remind you all, we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, your comment on the screen, we can have a fun back and forth here, is to use the tip and donation link at the bottom of your screen, gsmcpodcast.net. It's a huge help not only to us here at the network, but to you all. You get to have kind of a fun, interactive experience here, and maybe call me out on something that I might have not brought up, or just ask a question that you're wondering about. But let's jump right in, and let's talk about this revenue sharing agreement that could be coming to the SEC and the Big Ten fairly soon. We've talked about kind of what the future looks like for player compensation a lot on this show, and there's a number of different ideas thrown out there, right? We could do just straight up employment and contracts where the universities would just straight pay the players. You could stick with the NIL model where kids can only benefit off endorsement deals and that type of thing. But it seems like revenue sharing has been something that has caught on a lot of traction, especially among the players and the coaches who were former players, which we'll get into when we get into the UAB story. But this is a still kind of unrefined proposal, so still a ways to go to get to where they want to go, but it's called the modern model is what they're calling it, and they're hoping that this subsides or pretty much does away or settles that lawsuit that they have about NIL back pay that has been going on. It's called House versus the NCAA, that is set to go to trial next January, and that is a huge deal in college football. We talked about it last week. I said it's probably the most consequential thing happening in college football right now. So a lot of teams and a lot of athletic directors in particular are trying to get out in front of it. It looks like the settlement payment for that would be about $15 million to $20 million within each school to go around to, I believe it's 7,000 former players that they believe deserve to be paid in this settlement, and that's a lot of money for a lot of these schools. These athletic directors don't necessarily have that sitting around. Some do, don't get me wrong, but not necessarily the vast majority of schools. I can't remember what the exact number was. I want to say somewhere around 10% would be under some very intense financial circumstances if they were forced to pay that amount. So they're hoping that this possibly settles it for a number lower than that $15 to $20 million. But even if it does settle it for that number, at least you put that in the rearview mirror, and now you can focus on the present, which is, getting as much money in your pocket as possible to prepare for the discussions coming down the road for the structure of college football. And this obviously has a lot to do with that. ESPN reported on Monday night that them and the Power 5 conferences are in deep discussions to talk about this revenue sharing plan. Now, there's not really an idea of how it would be distributed or what that would look like per se, but it seems like it's gaining traction and people are actually having real conversations about it, and it's something that likely should have been happening for quite some time, if we're being totally honest with each other. But it's great, obviously, that the SEC and the Big Ten are leading the way on this. It's the two conferences that dictate a ton of the power in the grand scheme of things around college football. They're the two teams that are leading pretty much every category you could possibly think of when it comes to college football, whether it's money or talent acquisition or results on the field. Those are the two conferences that kind of set the pace. So these two conferences getting out ahead of this is absolutely fantastic. It's something that absolutely needed to happen, and I think it's something that we've been kind of fighting over for quite some time, partly because some people couldn't get their head around NIL, and then you'd have to throw this into the works, and it becomes a whole other thing. It goes back to the argument I've made on here a number of times where the NCAA had every chance to create this as a very smooth transition from, players getting a little bit of money with NIL to getting, more substantial money with revenue sharing, or getting into contracts and having a more stable foundation to work from. All of this is just, the NCAA being behind the ball of where they need to be. So now the conferences have stepped up. They've, approached their media deals and have said, this needs to happen, because at the end of the day, if it doesn't happen, it could cost us much more money with that back pay lawsuit, or with just figuring out a different way to go about business when it comes to paying these players. Jeffrey Kessler, the attorney for the back pay case, did not comment, so doesn't seem like there's a ton of traction quite yet to get that settled. Obviously, some of the details of this proposal needs to be ironed out for, the other party to listen to that, because there's no reason for Jeffrey Kessler and his team to listen to a conversation that, isn't fully thought out yet, I suppose. So I think there's going to be a ton of conversation around this over the next little bit. I think there will be so much going into what's kind of what the future of the NCAA looks like. But the reality is, this could be kind of the knockout punch for them. We've talked about it for a long time. The NCAA has kind of been hanging on by a thread for just a remarkable amount of time, whether it's, with NIL or with the transfer portal, or just with, the respect they have around college football in particular, but just college sports overall. I think it's been waning a lot in recent years. And one of the interesting things is, if you get this new way of things, and if you settle that suit, there's a reality where the NCAA, in the antitrust case, the damages could be tripled in that case if this does not, get fully resolved the way that the NCAA is very much hoping that they do. And if the case goes to jury and the NCAA loses, which Jeffrey Kessler and that group have said time and again, they feel incredibly confident that if it does go to trial, they will win. So that's not necessarily the best news for the NCAA. But if that were to happen, essentially the NCAA would be on the hook for about $4.2 billion in some form or another, in terms of NIL back pay, in terms of different things that go into this suit. So that's a crazy amount of money. Essentially, no matter how well you're doing financially, that's a crazy amount of money, and it's something that apparently 7,000 current and former athletes would be entitled to payment, whether that's, from appearing on former video games and things of that nature. There's plenty of things that go into this, but point blank, if the NCAA has to pay $4.2 billion to these former athletes or to whomever, they're dead. A quote from Matt Whitner, one of the a sports law attorney that CBS Sports talked to, he said, this is the case that could end the NCAA. So it feels like, excuse me, it does feel like there's a lot of things happening around the NCAA, and it feels like all of this has kind of been chipping away at a tree, right? You have to take a number of whacks for it to start to fall down. But once you take that last one, it falls down pretty quickly. And I think there is that case where, Florida State and the ACC battling has been really tough on the NCAA. Not setting up NIL rules has been really tough. Transfer portal struggles has been insanely tough. Tons of teams moving around and kids moving around and fans being mad and coaches being mad. All of this has been chipping away at the NCAA. But they needed a big thing to take them down, and it sounds like that last swing is starting to come with this new deal. And if it's $4.2 billion, the NCAA is pretty much cooked and pretty much has to be in damage control, I guess. I don't even know what the future would look like for the NCAA, but I know for a fact it would have very, very little to do with college football, because college football right now is in a position where the most powerful people in the room are Greg Sankey and Tony Petitti, are the guys that are controlling the biggest conferences in the country. So the NCAA essentially will not have any leg to stand on, especially if they lose that financial foothold that they have over some of these other conferences. So the NCAA is in trouble. It looks like that this could be the official knockout punch. Now, how quickly that's going to happen, I'm not necessarily sure. And what we see on the other side of that, I think, is the bigger question here. What is the governing body? Are the rules in place? Are they fair? Do they make sense for the players and for the teams? And also, are they the same across the board? I've talked about this a little bit, but having different conferences is a fantastic thing if you're talking about the play on the field, right? You love to see different styles. You'd love to see regional matchups, although that's kind of slowly going out the window as we get further and further down the road of conference realignment. But at the end of the day, having different conferences that have totally different interests creates problems. It creates rules that are not uniform across the board. It creates some transfer portal confusion with SEC players not being able to transfer to SEC schools, but only at certain times of the year. So there's a lot of confusion that goes on just because we have 5, or technically 4 really at this point, 4 different bodies that are working pretty much not in tandem, but totally unilaterally for what their best interests are. So it creates this issue that I think could only be 10 times worse if we get into a world where we're paying athletes with contracts and we're doing this type of thing. Those rules almost have to be uniform, because if they're not uniform, then it's going to be an arms race for who has the most lenient rules around contracts and around NIL and around the transfer portal, because that's what players want, right? The players want that extra power, and unless you come to a consensus of what this transfer portal is going to look like, what the payment for these players is going to look like, whether that's through revenue sharing and contracts for multiple years, or that's a 1 year type deal and you keep the transfer portal going the way that it has been, it doesn't necessarily matter. It just has to be unison across college football, or at least across the major conferences. We talked about the Group of 5 playoff a little bit, I believe last week, maybe on Monday. I cannot remember. It all kind of blends together. But regardless, the Power 5 is its own thing, and it should be its own thing, and we've talked about that a number of times, and they have to be working in unison. If they're working where the SEC and the Big Ten are at least kind of on the same page, and then the Big 12 and the ACC are kind of on the same page, or maybe the Pac-12, whoever knows what happens with the ACC, I'm still wildly confused on what's going on there. There was a new development there we'll get to tomorrow, but point is, all of these conferences just have to work in unison going forward. If you want the sport to be the best version of itself, if you want the sport to remain, some of what we love about the sport, these 4 conferences just have to move in tandem. They have to move in unison. And if they don't, it creates more turmoil. Oh my gosh. It creates more problems. It creates a lot more pressure on these conferences, and probably a lot more division between them. So this is obviously a great thing when you bring in revenue sharing to college football. I think it's something that a lot of people have been in favor for quite some time, to be totally honest with you, and it's taken quite a while to get here. But the reality is, this does create some hurdles that have to be, leaped over, whether it comes to setting up the contracts the right way, and making sure that they are maybe multi-year, and stuff like that. Making sure that the conferences are moving in tandem and have the same rules and have the same regulations, and don't set up one conference to, soar in this new era while one conference really struggles because they have different rules in place. So this is a good thing. This is a step in the right direction to get everything under control, to get a handle on NIL and tampering, to have an understanding of what's going on in the transfer portal and with roster construction, and have a little bit of clarity in college football. But there are things that have to be overcome to get to that point where there is clarity across the board. Because it'd be great to know what's going on in the SEC and the Big Ten, but if the ACC and the Big 12 don't follow suit, then you have a reality where the SEC and the Big Ten probably break off from the other two and create even more division. So that's obviously not what we want, but this is a step in the right direction. Hopefully the ACC and the Big 12 can get in the room with these two conferences and kind of figure out what the next steps are, because if they're not all moving in tandem, it could be an interesting couple of years. I'll put it that way. But we'll see what happens there. We'll unpack that as it happens, and hopefully some other conferences can come into this conversation. But one of the teams have come into this conversation. UAB has joined a players association that I want to get to right after this. We'll talk about kind of the impact of that and what some other teams might do. Is this kind of a door opening moment for a lot of these teams, or is this just kind of a blip on something that might not define the future? But we'll get into all that right after this, so stick with us.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing. Sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown. Get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Alrighty, welcome back, everyone. We just talked about the revenue sharing model that was introduced by the SEC and the Big Ten. A ton of news that will be coming out around that over the next probably couple of months. Still some things to iron out there, but definitely a very interesting thing that I think will likely start to happen around college football, not just the SEC and the Big Ten. But let's talk about UAB football. There has been a huge happening around there. Trent Dilfer is the coach over there, and he was a huge part of this, apparently. It sounds like UAB has officially joined the Athletes Organization, a players association aimed at, representing the interest of college athletes on a national level. So this is something kind of new to college football. Apparently, Trent Dilfer was was very much in favor of this decision and was pushing his players to make this decision. Obviously was a former member of the NFL Players Association when he was there, and this is a wild move for a number of reasons. They are the first D1 school to come to agreement with an association that has actual legs, so it'll be very interesting to see how this kind of affects. Obviously, Trent Dilfer being a part of this makes total sense. He's been in the NFL. He understands that likely this current model of paying college athletes is more unfair than it is fair. And then we also had Jim Harbaugh has been in big favor of this. I know Nick Saban has spoken about it a number of times. So all guys with NFL experience understand what that looks like on the NFL level and think that it probably should be brought down to the college football level. Now, the question is kind of what is this new organization and how will it kind of work? So there's a number of different people that are involved in it, and it's a really impressive group when you really look at it. So you have kind of the owner, the guy that set up the organization is a former linebacker at Penn and spent 10 years in the NFL named Brandon Copeland, a guy that is really on the forefront of all of this and has kind of led the charge. But he has plenty of people behind him. He has a Georgia alum, Amari Hardwick. You have a former All-SEC safety, Roman Harper, ex-Syracuse coach, and Jim Boeheim. So these are big names. These are guys that actually really matter in not only the world of college football, but the world of college sports. I mean, there's very few people that you can put above Jim Boeheim when you talk about the effect on college athletics over the last, 2 decades or so. So absolutely huge for them. You have a couple of basketball players that have already joined the Players Association with R.J. Davis at North Carolina and Jeremy Roach at Duke. So two very talented kids. R.J. Davis likely heading on to the NBA this year. But really, really big names there. And then you have Malachi Moore, a defensive back for Alabama, who's one of the bigger names in all of college football, who has joined as well. So very, very interesting group of people. I think having multiple current athletes, having former legends, having the coaches all involved is huge for this sport for a number of reasons. You want, obviously, this thing to work out and to be the best thing for the players, and it feels like they're setting themselves up to do exactly that, right? You have all these people that have been through these experiences. When you talk about Roman Harper, when you talk about Brandon Copeland, they've been through the battles that a lot of these kids are fighting right now. The only difference is they didn't get NIL checks. So they see how, far the system has come, but also see, probably hasn't come far enough. When you look at these media deals that these conferences sign, that these schools get, it's insane amounts of money. Let's be totally honest with each other. And it's very few people that are more responsible for that money coming in than the players that put their body on the line every weekend on the field, right? So it's, in my opinion, the way that college football works right now, with just NIL being the way that that players can make money, is insane. That's why I am in huge favor of the revenue sharing. That's another reason why I'm in huge favor of players associations going forward. I think it's something that is unbelievably vital to the way of college sports going down the road. And there's a really interesting quote that I want to get into here. I probably should have made a little graphic for it, but I'll do that next time, I promise. But it was a very interesting quote by Brandon Copeland talking about why he did this and why what he said essentially when he went to UAB. And he said the reason why we set up doingathletes.org is because, frankly, we want to see y'all eat. We want to see y'all win. I'm tired of seeing people take advantage of us. Who represents the athletes? Who's going to be fighting for you to get a bigger piece? And finally, the biggest part of this, we like to say that decisions are being made about you without you. And I think that's the biggest thing in college sports right now. We have a ton of people up top making really important decisions that affect these kids' everyday lives and affect their livelihood going forward, and the kids aren't in the room. Not even a representative for the kids is in the room, which is just insane. And while I fully understand that these are 18 to 22-year-olds that, might not fully grasp the, discussions that they're having and the intense nature of all of this stuff, it affects them more than it affects anyone else. They have a bigger impact on the sport than anyone else. They have a bigger impact on college athletics than anyone else. They are the most important thing when it comes to college sports, and the idea that we have been making decisions even over the last 2 decades without them in the room is insane, but especially now when we understand what this sport is. There are a ton of people that would love to tell you that this sport is not, that college athletics is not professional sports. It is. We gotta stop having the conversation where I understand athletics is not the end-all be-all. Academics should absolutely be a part of these conversations, and I wish it was a bigger part of these conversations, but these kids are playing professional sports. They are getting compensated for playing a sport, and pretty much just for playing the sport. Like, let's be totally honest with each other. That's why they're getting these NIL deals. That's why they are the players they are, and that's why they're getting the money that they're getting. So we need to react like a professional sport would. And I understand you don't want to be exactly like the NFL, but you also don't want to be in a situation where a ton of people are making decisions that aren't in the best interest for the players, because I think we found time and again the best thing for the sport tends to be the best thing for the players. Now that the line can be jumped fairly quickly, I think it has been when you come to the transfer portal and that type of thing. But I think for the most part, when you're catering to the players, you're doing something that's likely good for the sport, that likely will push the sport forward. This is another thing that absolutely has to happen. There's no amateur model anymore. There's no, pure and chaste, beautiful model that we can all act like was happening in college football. It's now a professional sport, and we need to treat it that way. And the way to do that, above all else, is to just give these players a voice in the discussion. These players, put their body on the line. They give everything they can for their team and for this sport and for some of these contracts to get signed, because without them, this doesn't exist. And that's just kind of the reality that we need to come to grips with. For some reason, it's taken this long to get to this point where we've said, well, maybe these guys that are actually fighting the battle should be in on the conversations. But I'm glad we're finally here. I'm glad someone finally stood up. Huge shout out to Brandon Copeland for being the person that has set up this organization that is gaining a lot of traction. And having someone like UAB in on the fold, while it's not a huge school, and I likely do think you will need to get more and more schools involved in this and bigger schools involved in this for it to really kind of snowball down the road, this is huge. And especially having someone like Trent Dilfer, who I think we all know is not shy to speak his mind in pretty much any context. And I think if you put him in front of a mic and you ask him about this, which I'm sure will happen fairly soon, he's going to be honest with you, and he's going to say very, very plainly that the way that the current compensation for these athletes is working is just not okay. It's essentially taking advantage of these kids for the work that they're putting in. They are not getting adequate payback on what they're putting in. And I understand there's the big argument of, well, that kid got a Lambo when you went to Texas, and that kid got a so-and-so when you went wherever. That is the 1% of what is going on in NIL, what is going on in college athletics. There are tons of kids that are out there just trying to get what they can. They are still living relatively normal college lives, that are still going to practice and buying a cheap meal right afterwards. And, there are still those kids out there, even if they are in college athletics in the NIL era. And the idea that those kids get totally cut out of this new world that we've opened up for so many different athletes is insane. So it's not necessarily that I think kids at Alabama or kids at Texas or kids, in these big time programs around college football are struggling by any means when it comes to NIL, at least the big names on that roster. I'm not necessarily saying that by any means. What I am saying is those aren't the only kids that this affects, and those aren't the only kids that need a voice in this room, whether it's, a couple of UAB football players or Stanford volleyball players or North Dakota lacrosse players. I don't even care who it is, but you need athletes' voices in that room. You need multiple of them in that room, and it needs to be a diverse group of people, because when you look at college athletics and you look at all the different tiers that we've kind of broken these sports up into and the way that it's kind of bared itself out during the NIL era, we have to start putting some of the power in the hands of the smaller athletes. This is a great step forward with putting this on the map with a football program joining, and having some guys like Malachi Moore in on the picture is a absolutely great thing. But you need multiple sports, you need multiple entities, you need bigger schools to join in, whether that's, a small sport at a big school. You need interesting, you need more, I guess is the best way to put it. I think this is a great idea. I think it's something that will absolutely be a part of college football going forward, and you would be, I think, if you're holding out hope that there won't be a players association, I wouldn't hold out hope too much longer, because that is something that pretty much has to come if you're going to have contracts, if you're going to have negotiations with revenue sharing and all of the different things around that kind of milieu. You have to have players in on those discussions, and this is the only real way to do it. Now, is the athletes organization, the Brandon Copeland setup, is that going to be the entity that ends up doing it? I don't necessarily know, but I do know that that has the most momentum, and I'm sure that a ton of college coaches and players are watching that very closely, because I think it's something that just needs to gain traction. I think it's crazy that we spent so much of the time in college athletics not having those kids in on that discussion, or at least not having a representative for those kids in on that discussion, because we've seen time and again where the kids have not exactly been put first. The, monetary value or the revenue or whatever you want to call it has been put first, and it's something that just has to change. So this is obviously something that will need more traction, will need kind of that snowball effect where you start to get more teams and bigger teams and all of that thing. They need that to happen for the athletes organization to take the steps forward that are necessary to become a mainstay in college football and college sports, but they're well on their way. They have added a huge number of big-time players. Adding UAB as a full team is absolutely massive, and like the NCAA we were talking about, it's chipping away at a tree, and then one day that thing falls after one big swing. The big swing could be happening pretty soon, because I promise you, if Malachi Moore is in this thing, if the UAB football team has come to a full consensus agreement to join this thing, there's very few college football athletes that are not looking at this, and very few college athletes in general that are not looking at this, because they need a voice. It's crazy that they haven't had one before. It's crazy that they aren't in these rooms, because they're the people that understand what makes this sport great. They're the people that need as much, as much of a voice in these conversations as anyone. So a lot of things will happen with this. Kudos to UAB for being the first full team to kind of jump into that, take that leap of faith into this new era, and we'll see what happens with it. But it's something that has been long overdue, in my opinion. I think the second that they introduced NIL, I think there had to be player representatives in those conversations. There weren't, but finally we're at a point where it looks like all this player empowerment and all of this movement that has been happening in college football over the last little bit is finally, being put in the hands of the players for the first time in quite some time. So it'll be really interesting to watch that unfold. I'm sure there will be much more information that I'll get into as it comes out, but UAB has opened the door at least. We'll see if anyone else walks through it, but we're going to take our second break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk about the transfer portal. It has been a ton of stuff going on, a couple of commitments. It just closed for everyone that is not a graduate transfer, so I want to break down where we sit and kind of what you guys can kind of expect over the next couple of weeks as the recruiting continues on. So stick with us, and we will be right back with that.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about UAB joining a players association and kind of what that effect might have coming down the road. I'm a big favor of player associations, but I'm sure there will be a lot of people that are against me on that. So we'll figure out how that goes, and definitely a ton more to unpack there. But let's go to the transfer portal for the time being, and let's talk about what's going on. There has been a ton of movement over the last couple of days. The portal is officially closed, so that has wrapped up, although grad transfers do have until, I believe, midnight tonight to enter their name, but a lot of the big names are set where they are, whether that's in the portal or committed to somewhere else or staying where they are. But there are a couple of teams that came out a little bit unscathed. Mainly, I believe Georgia didn't have really much of anyone leave that was super important. Alabama took some hits towards the end that we'll get here in a second, but definitely kind of the big dogs came out okay, and some other teams got hit, which is exactly the way that we kind of saw this unfolding. Now, I thought it would be a little bit more hectic, but we ended up getting a little bit of quieter than I thought, although it was not necessarily quiet by any means. But let's first get to some commitments, and then we'll get to some intel for some of the guys that are still in the portal. Ja'Cory Brown, a quarterback out of Miami, has found his way to UCF, and that is a team we will be talking about quite a bit on this segment because they have been doing absolute work out there. Gus Malzahn has been doing incredible stuff in Orlando and has been bringing in some big-time guys with a couple more that he has his eyes set on. But Ja'Cory Brown, I think, is a fantastic fit for this offense. You saw John Race Plumlee do it a year ago where it was a very, run-heavy, athletic, let the quarterback go out and do his thing type offense. Ja'Cory Brown just takes that to the next level. He's going to be incredible. Now, I don't know if he's the starter, depending on how quickly he can pick up the playbook and get on the field. But I know for a fact that if you want Gus Malzahn's offense run well, you need someone like Ja'Cory Brown at the stick. So I think it'll be really interesting to watch that unfold. Tad Hudson is a quarterback from North Carolina. That was a very highly touted kid coming out of high school that just never really caught on at North Carolina. There was obviously some interesting things that happened in the transfer portal. Bringing in Max Johnson probably didn't give him as much hope, I suppose, that he was going to be the starting guy. So he found a new place to play. He ends up at Coastal Carolina. I think it's a fantastic pickup, not only for Coastal Carolina, but for him. I think whether or not he starts this year is kind of irrelevant to me. I think he's someone that can be a starter for 3 years for them, kind of the Grayson McCall type of things. Whether he finds his way back up to the ACC, I don't know, but I do think he's someone that could have a very, very good career in the G5 and possibly be a guy that we're talking about as a late round draft pick a couple years down the road here. And then Jacoby Criswell, when we talk about North Carolina quarterbacks, he was a guy that was a North Carolina quarterback for quite some time, found his way to Fayetteville for a year before finding his way right back to North Carolina. I'm sure that was a little bit of an awkward conversation he had to have with Mac Brown, but it seems like he has found his way back to North Carolina, will likely sit behind Max Johnson, as we talked about, for a year, but then this kid can absolutely hit the ground running. I think this is a very, very talented kid. I think he has a ton of ability, both with his legs and with his arm. Now, the first run at North Carolina didn't necessarily go the way that you would have loved, but the door is much more open than it was while he was there. So I think he's someone that could definitely help them out with the run game, but also just be a huge piece for them, understand the offense, and kind of get them moving a little bit up there in Chapel Hill. But I don't necessarily think it'll be this year, but at least you have someone in the wings that you feel confident in if you are Mac Brown and you have to send him out there. Devon Booth, a running back from Utah State, has committed to Mississippi State. They had to replace Rashad Amos, who came from Miami of Ohio, before finding his way to Colorado. So just an idea of what this transfer portal window looked like. But Jeff Lebby has done a great job of handling all the craziness that has happened around him as a first-time head coach. Obviously, this has been a very, very weird portal cycle that he has found himself in. And Mississippi State is probably going to struggle for the majority of next year. But at the end of the day, Jeff Lebby, at the very least, is showing that he can handle what he has to handle as a coach in the Power 5 as of right now in college football. So a couple more back-end guys here. Ryan Yates, the safety from LSU, has found his way to California. This is a kid that has played a ton of football, just not necessarily has put out the greatest tape in the world, but I do think a change of scenery could be huge for him. I think Cal needs as many bodies as they can in the back end, and whenever you can get a guy from from a program like LSU, you never really hesitate, do you? Ed Woods, a cornerback from Arizona State, has found his way to Michigan State. This is a big-time pickup for a team that is absolutely bleeding in the portal. So many guys walking out the door, especially across that defensive line. So definitely needed some help, and definitely needed Jonathan Smith to just smile a little bit. So definitely got him a little bit happier yesterday, but definitely a lot of guys leaving that program. It'll be a very interesting one to watch, but a huge pickup for them. And then you got Colton Hood, a cornerback from Auburn, who's found his way to Colorado. This was a bit of a twofer for the Buffs. They got Colton Hood's younger brother, Brandon, who is a 3-star running back in 2024, to also commit. So works out for them both ways. You get a recruit, you get a guy that can impact you right away. And I think this is a huge piece for them to help out with the back-end depth. He might actually be the guy that ends up starting Cross from Travis Hunter. So we'll see what happens there, but definitely tons of ability there and tons of football that he has played at a really high level, obviously at the in the SEC. But let's get to what this kind of looks like right now. And there's a couple of names still out there. Nick Evers, I haven't really heard much about him in the portal. I think he'll probably find his way to a Group of 5 program, but who knows there. The running backs are still pretty much absolutely loaded, but we started with the D-line last time, so why don't we start with a couple other positions, and then we'll work our way down. Alabama took a little bit of a hit yesterday, and they took the hit where they absolutely could not afford to take it. Peyton Woodyard is a very, very talented safety who was coming out of the 2024 class, was there for about 3 months, I guess, and then has found his way out of the program. I guess he gave, the new regime a chance to see what it was like. It wasn't for him, so he's finding a new place to play. It looks like Oregon is the massive leader there, definitely will be the team to beat, and I think this would be a huge pickup for him, Dan Lanning, that is, and Oregon. I think this would be a guy that could be a three-year starter for your program and kind of command that defense on the back end. Not sure if he'll start his first year, but can definitely help them out down the road and be a huge part of that defense going forward. And then they also had Tony Mitchell find his way into the portal. This is probably the bigger of the two just because Tony Mitchell has a little bit more football under his belt and has a little bit more understanding of the defense, but this is a big hit. I'm not sure exactly where he's leaning right now. I think there's a number of schools that will be after him. I think Texas is one to watch with this one because they need some help on that back end, and Tony Mitchell is a very, very talented player. But we'll see what happens there. I think that's a tough loss for a position group and a position room that has already been gutted pretty good. Obviously lost a ton of guys to the portal, lost 3 guys to the NFL, so it's been tough for the new DB coach over there, Maurice Lindquist, but they still have some guys in there that can absolutely give them some good snaps. They just are a little bit thinner than they're used to being. And I talked about Texas with Tony Mitchell possibly. The reason for that is Terrence Brooks has found his way out the door, a very talented corner from Texas, started for them last year, had a little bit of a tough moment in the spring game where Arch Manning had that deep ball to start his day, but it looks like UTSA is the team that's kind of emerging as the possibility for his next stop. This would be a very interesting situation, but I think it's something that could be happening more and more when you look around college football. This is a talented kid that absolutely could go to a Power 5 school. I have no doubt in my mind that there is someone in the Power 5 that would love to get this kid's services. The question is, if he gets on that if he gets to that program, he has to learn the defense. Would he be a starter right away? And would that team have the ability to play the number of games that UTSA could possibly play, right? When you look at the new college football playoff model, G5 team has to get in. UTSA is a very good team that is going to have a lot to say about that G5 team, so maybe he's just setting himself up to possibly play on a big stage against a big-time team, whether that's at their home stadium or not. It doesn't necessarily matter. I think he's kind of playing this as, I'm going to go to a smaller school, I'm going to be the best player on the defensive side of the ball and make tons of plays and show my athletic ability and possibly even make a playoff run if everything falls the way that he's hoping. So a very interesting move, something that I think we could see a little bit more down the road, especially with guys that might just be more comfortable in that state at this point and might just want to stick around. So it'll be interesting to see that kind of develop, but it seems like UTSA could be getting a fantastic corner in Terrence Brooks. And then Jason Zandamela, a very, very talented interior offensive lineman that kind of the same way of Peyton Woodyard from Bama was on campus in USC for about 3 months before finding his way out. It seems like this is a Florida UCF battle. I believe he is a Florida kid, so that makes total sense. I would lean towards Florida to win this one out, but UCF has been pulling off some stuff on the portal trail that I'm not going to put anything by him by any means. I mean, one of the big things that I've seen develop over the last couple of days, Penny Boone, the very talented kid out of Toledo who seemed like he was going to Kentucky. It was all but signed that he was going to Kentucky. And then some academic things happened where he wasn't going to be able to transfer enough credit hours for it to make sense and for him to graduate on time. So he's finding his way somewhere else. And it seems like UCF might be the leader there as well. And if you had Penny Boone and Ja'Cory Brown in the same backfield and you had a run game with them, it would be really, really tough to guard. I'll be honest with you. That would be an absolutely nasty read option that would have DNs and linebackers confused day in and day out. But then finally, for everyone but the D linemen, Takario Davis has been a big-time name in this portal for quite some time. In fact, I still have his name on here. It should not be on here. He is someone that has decided to stay put in Arizona. Dwayne Aquina, the defensive coordinator there, was very, very optimistic that this would be the case, and it officially is. A huge, huge thing for Arizona because they were bleeding a little bit in the portal, especially on the defensive side of the ball, so bringing back someone like Davis is absolutely huge for them. But let's get over to the D linemen, and let's start with the edge. Tyler Barron is someone to watch over the next couple of weeks, a guy that was at Tennessee, committed to Ole Miss, then decommitted, found his way to Louisville, now is back in the portal and is finding his way somewhere else. And it seems like the three teams to watch here are Miami, Ole Miss is back in the conversation, and then USC. I'm a little bit shocked that Ole Miss has decided to get back in that recruitment, but it seems like Miami might have the inside track here, but USC, I believe a visit is coming up for them pretty soon. So definitely one to watch. Guy could be an absolute game changer, especially for a team like USC that needs as much help on the defensive line as possible. And they're hoping to get it on the interior as well. Derek Harmon is a guy from Michigan State, one of the many guys that has found their way out of Michigan State, especially at that D-line position. And it looks like he is kind of zeroing in on USC and Colorado. There have been teams like Oregon, Ohio State, Florida State, LSU, Miami were all kind of pushing for him, but it doesn't seem like those are catching up a lot of steam. So USC or Colorado feel like the team to watch. If you paired him with Bear Alexander at USC, that's a pretty disgusting duo. I'll be totally honest with you. That could totally transform that defense and at least make them very stout against the run, which would be a huge plus for this defense and definitely would give them a massive leg up on where they were a year ago. So that's one that USC really needs to buckle down and hopefully get a commitment there. And then Dominic Williams, probably the biggest defensive tackle that is still on the board. Someone that we've talked about a little bit. It seems like it's a Texas OU battle, but LSU is pushing late very, very aggressively. Bo Davis needs someone in that interior that is going to be a big-time player. And Dominic Williams is a NFL-level talent. He is someone that can absolutely turn into a remarkable player at that position. I would still lean Texas as of right this second, but who knows? This could go any number of directions, and I think that his commitment is coming down the barrel here pretty soon. It could be even today, so we will update you on that probably tomorrow with some type of short or something, but if that does end up happening. But definitely a guy to watch, probably the most highly sought-after guy in the entire portal right now, if I had to imagine. So tons going on. The portal has been absolutely insane. Not necessarily the craziness that I envision, but still plenty to go on, still plenty to unpack, and a couple of teams got hit very, very hard. Obviously, Michigan State, Colorado have been two teams that it feels like we're talking about a ton. Miami is a team that feels like they upgraded. UCF is kind of in the process of doing that as well. Tons of other teams have picked up guys here and there that will be very, very helpful. Another one that I want to talk about, actually, Elijah Badger. Seems like Florida is picking up steam more and more there. If they add him, I think him and Trey Wilson, would be a just remarkable duo for Graham Mertz and would make that Florida team even more interesting, which we'll get into probably on the next Spotlight Wednesday. But for this Spotlight Wednesday, we are going to talk about the Nebraska Cornhuskers. And there is so much going on around that program. There is so much pressure around that program. Let's be totally honest with each other. There is a lot of intense pressure around Matt Rule, around this team as a whole, but especially around Dylan Raiola. So I wanted to get to all of that, kind of unpack what I expect from Dylan Raiola, this offense, this defense, and how they're shaping up to be maybe a better team than people are prepared for Nebraska to be. But we'll get to all that right after this, so stick with us.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC. to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about a little bit of the transfer portal update. The portal window has officially closed for everyone that is not a grad transfer. So tons of stuff happening. Still recruitment's going on, but a lot of guys have either picked where they're going or the signs are very, very clear of where they're going to end up. But we will definitely continue to unpack that, give you guys updates when needed. But let's get into Nebraska, and let's talk about this season that is ahead for them. A huge season. I apologize, my hair is a little bit all over the place right now. But a huge season ahead of them, and it all is because of one guy. Dylan Raiola is the most important person, you could argue, in college football this year. When you talk about how much one fan base is putting on one person, it'd be hard to find someone that outweighs Dylan Raiola. Now, you could go to Shedeur Sanders, who absolutely has a ton on his shoulders every single day. You could go to a number of different teams, but Dylan Raiola is the guy that, man, I can't imagine being put in this position, but he's handling it really well right now. But let's jump in and kind of do this how we usually do this, go offense, defense, and then we'll go to schedule, and then kind of just get my overall thoughts on what this season could look like for the Cornhuskers. So a lot of this has to do with some of the craziness that has been going on around the Big Ten in general. There feels like there's a little bit more of an opening in the college football world when it comes to the Big Ten in particular. You have Oregon coming in, who I think is going to be a great team, but when you look at USC, UCLA, and Washington, not necessarily the teams that they were a year ago, not necessarily the threats that a lot of people maybe expected them to be coming in to the Big Ten. And then you have Michigan replacing all of those guys that just found their way to the NFL. So many guys that has to be replaced there. Ohio State's obviously shaping up to be a great team. Penn State is still kind of up in the air. So there's openings, I guess is the best way to put it, and Nebraska is a team that absolutely is going to be after one of those openings, and it all starts with this offense, right? We looked at the defense last year. It was really good, and we'll get to that a little bit later, but the offense starts and almost ends with Dylan Raiola, right? He is the guy that has been pitched as the savior of Nebraska football. He's the one that they want to bring them back to the top of college football. Can he handle that? He looked more than fine on Saturday, but we'll find out in the fall if he can fully handle what's being put on his shoulders. Now, there's a lot of stuff in place to make that a little bit easier on him. Marcus Satterfield is his offensive coordinator, has done a great job pretty much everywhere he's been. Struggled a little bit when he was up there with the Panthers, but at the end of the day, this is a guy that can not only create really good offense, but create offense that is digestible, create offense that is dictated by the run. When you have guys like Gabe Ervin Jr. and Raheem Johnson, who both actually are coming back from injury, but once they do, they should be more than fine in that running back room. Also have Dante Dowdle, who is a transfer from Oregon, so there's plenty of talent there. And Marcus Satterfield, if we know anything about him during his time at Baylor and during his time at Temple, running the ball is going to be the place where their money is made. And then you'll take your chances where they find them in the passing game, and you got plenty of guys to throw to in the passing game as well. Isaiah Nair, a transfer from Texas, has shown to be a very smooth route runner, a guy that can get downfield very quickly and kind of unlock that arm talent that we've heard so much about when we talk about Dylan Raiola, and we saw a little bit of it on Saturday. And then you have Jamal Banks, who I tend to believe is going to be the wide receiver one. He came over from Wake Forest, and definitely a very, very talented kid, someone that could absolutely be the go-to guy for Raiola, but that doesn't end the wide receiver room by any means. There are plenty other guys in there. Garcia Castaneda, I can never get that name out right. Malachi Coleman, and especially Jalen Lloyd, who has come on very, very strong in the spring. They have a very capable group. Now, you do need some guys to step up the way that they haven't quite been asked in the past, like Isaiah Nair. But at the end of the day, very talented guys, guys that have a ton of ability. And if Dylan Raiola can put balls the way that on them the way that he was on Saturday, they won't have any struggle in this offense by any means. The O-line is the big question mark here. They really struggled with that front. So poorly, in fact, that they made Colorado's defensive front look dominant in that game that they played. And we found out very quickly that was not a dominant defensive front. So tons of stuff needs to happen there. They did bring in Micah Mazuka from Florida, a very talented guy at right guard that absolutely will be a starter for them right away. They're bringing back a lot of guys from last year, which is kind of a double-edged sword because it wasn't the best unit, obviously, but those guys could definitely have grown since then. We'll obviously find out what all of that is. Dylan Raiola does have some of that athletic ability to get out of those hairy situations, but it's not necessarily his calling card, right? One of his best things is sticking in the pocket, slinging balls out there, and doing the remarkable things that he can do with his arm. So I would expect a O-line to be very, very important to his success in the upcoming years. So as long as they're improved a little bit, can run block really well so you can, not face as many aggressive blitz on passing downs, I think that would be very helpful. But a lot of stuff is set up. I think overall it's a stronger group than it was a year ago by a mile. Pretty much every single position has been upgraded at least a little bit to help them out. The running back room, getting Dante Dowdle, I think, is a fantastic pickup. I think adding Isaiah Nayer and Jamal Banks in the wide receiver room makes you totally different group at that position. And then Dylan Raiola, obviously, is the biggest pickup maybe across the entire country this past year when you talk about impact on their team. But let's move on over to the defense, and let's talk about some of the guys that you're seeing right here. That is Tommy Hill right there, one of the guys that is returning on the back end. Isaac Gifford, another guy. Between them, they had 5 interceptions, 17 pass breakups, tons of talent there. Bly Hill is the other corner on the other side. He came in from a very small school this year, but has taken a ton of steps forward in the spring, has really wowed and did some really good things in the spring game for Nebraska, so that'll be really interesting to watch. But this D-line is really where everything starts. It's a very, very solid group. You have Nash Hutmacher, Nash Hutmacher and Ty Robinson, 2 guys that a lot of people around the program say these are NFL caliber defensive tackles. They're going to be holding down the interior defensive line. And then you have Jamari Butler coming off the edge. All guys that have been very talented in the past. Now, they did lose Chief Borders to the portal, which was not one they were expecting because he had an absolutely huge spring and it kind of burst onto the scene. But they still have guys behind him that can definitely help out. You have MJ Sherman, you have Princewell Umanmielen, who is the brother of Princely Umanmielen down there at Ole Miss. So you have guys behind him that can definitely help out, but a pretty big loss there with Chief Borders finding a new place to play. Maybe they can pull him out of the portal, who knows, but definitely a guy to watch as we go throughout the next little bit in the transfer portal. At linebacker, the guy that is stealing the show is a freshman, Vincent Shavers, who kind of had an interesting situation, was a part of the Miami class until they kept bringing in players. And when you bring in players to a class that can only have so many kids, some kids get cut, and that's exactly what happened to him pretty much, and he found his way to Nebraska and has been absolutely incredible. Now, this position group overall is a little bit tougher of a group. Stephon Thompson is another guy that could absolutely be used as a useful rotational piece there, but this is a thin group. When you talk about this defense, definitely the point of attack, I suppose, for offenses is this linebacker group, but they definitely will get better throughout time, and I think Vincent Shavers has shown just give him a little bit of time on the football field and he'll be more than fine. So it'll be really interesting to see that develop. This was a really good defense last year, 11th in the country when you talk about total defense, and it was really the offense that held them back a little bit. So I'm sure they're very happy to have Dylan Raiola and all those guys coming in. I think this is going to be one of the better defenses in the Big Ten. And if you're one of the better defenses in the Big Ten, you're one of the better in the country. So the question is, I guess, how many of those guys will step up? How many of those guys will take that next step? MJ Sherman, I think, is a hugely important person for them going forward. Tons of guys that need to step up, but I think this defense is going to be really, really good, really solid, not make a lot of mistakes, kind of that bend but don't break mentality for them, and I think it'll benefit them greatly. But let's get to their schedule and kind of break down what that looks like, because there's a lot going on here, and it's a relatively navigable schedule. Not necessarily easy by any means, but you start with UTEP. That's a layup. If that's not a layup, we have a different conversation to have about Nebraska after week 1. But then you get to the Colorado game, and that's going to be a huge game. Obviously, a game that you lost a year ago that you probably should have won. Anyone that watched that game, it was a defensive battle right after Colorado put up about 1 million points on TCU, and it was not what we were expecting, but it looks like this year it feels like Nebraska is on a little bit better of footing. Now Colorado is as well, so I think that will be a very, very fun game, kind of similar to last year, but just more playmakers on the field, to be totally honest with you. But then you have Northern Iowa, you have Illinois at home, and then you go to Purdue before finishing this first little bit off with Rutgers before you get to your first bye. All of those games are winnable. I don't think there's any question about that. They could very easily start this year 6-0, but that Colorado game is obviously the toss-up. Also, at Purdue can get a little bit sketchy. Illinois is not necessarily the easiest opponent, so none of these are necessarily, outright layups aside from UTEP and Northern Iowa, I hope. But I do think this is a stretch where you could see Nebraska just continue to climb up those boards and continue to have wins on that record, and it'll be really interesting if they get to that first bye week 6-0. You'll hear some very, very interesting talk around Nebraska now. Are those the most impressive 6 wins in the world? Probably not, but at the end of the day, still a lot of momentum going on going into that bye week, and then coming out of it, you have at Indiana, you have at Ohio State. 2 games that will be hugely important. If you can split those 2, you're not going to beat Ohio State at home. If you beat Ohio State at home, Dylan Raiola should get a statue outside the stadium that night. But if they can beat Indiana, if they can keep that momentum rolling, maybe you drop one to Ohio State, that's fine. And then that UCLA game will be very interesting. You don't really know what you're getting, obviously, the first time that they're facing off as Big Ten opponents. So that will be a very interesting game to watch. UCLA, I would say, is not necessarily on the best of footing right now. So I'd lean towards Nebraska in that game right now, but tons can change before then, before you get to your last bye. And then this last 3 games, in my opinion, are the ones that will define whether this team ends, 8-4 or 9-3 or 6-6 or 7-5. These games are hugely important. At USC is a team, logically, if you look at them roster for roster, I would probably take Nebraska's roster. The question then becomes, can you handle, traveling that far and handling a atmosphere you've never had to be in? And maybe Miller Moss ends up being the quarterback that we saw in the bowl game and not the quarterback we saw in the spring game. And maybe some of the defensive struggles come along a little bit faster than you would assume for USC. So that's a very sketchy game. That's kind of a toss-up in my eyes. And then Wisconsin, kind of the same thing. I'm not really sure how they kind of fit with Wisconsin. I think Wisconsin is one of the very big unknowns in college football this upcoming year. So you never really know what that game's going to hold. And then at Iowa, that could be a total toss-up. Playing at Iowa is incredibly tough. That defense is going to be good. There's no question about that. That offense, hopefully, will be a little bit better than it was a year ago. So a lot of those games will, be able to unpack a little bit more as the season goes on. But those are 3 hugely important games for Nebraska, either finishing it off on a great foot and going into 2025 with all this momentum and Dylan Raiola as your quarterback for the second year, and all the things are going the exact way that they want them to go. But then there's that other reality where you drop those 3 games and you go into 2025 questioning what's going on with your program and worried about this, that, and the other. So there's a ton of variability within the schedule, but it's very doable. There is tons of opportunities for them to make some noise in the schedule. I think beating Colorado would be a huge win just because of the national perception of that game and of that team. Then you get at Ohio State. I don't necessarily think you'll win that game, but that obviously gives you a massive opportunity to put your name on the map. And then you get at USC, you get at Iowa, Wisconsin. These games, don't necessarily seem like the sexiest games in the world when you look at them at face value, but they're going to be really tightly contested and going to be the games that Nebraska, has lost in the past and needs to win going forward. So it'll be really interesting to watch this all unfold. I think when you talk about this Nebraska team, there's so many different things at play, right? There's so many different variables and unknowns. It all starts with that guy in Dylan Raiola, obviously, because he is the person that is going to make this team go. He's going to be the person that in the games where they lose by 6 points or they lose by 3 points, he would be the guy that would get those 3 or 6 points, right? He would be the guy that gives them more stability at quarterback and doesn't put their defense in bad situations and does the things that have been really lacking around Nebraska for quite some time. So it'll be really interesting to watch this unfold. I think the talent has gotten immensely better around there. Probably one of the bigger talent jumps over year to year in college football this year when you talk about where they were a year ago, especially at the quarterback position. No disrespect to Henrik Harburg, but definitely not what you want when you're running around the Big Ten up there. So having Dylan Raiola at the sticks is huge. If he can burst on the scenes, things get very, very interesting in Lincoln, Nebraska very quickly. I think this year is likely a build-up year, if I'm being totally honest. I think there will be some of those freshman mistakes that tend to happen with these quarterbacks when they first come onto the scene, especially in the Big Ten where you're facing incredibly tough defenses week in and week out. So I think this will be a little bit of a build-up year. I think they're a team that could beat some teams they're not supposed to beat, but also lose to some teams they're not supposed to lose to. They could kind of have that, learning how to win type of year that all these teams need to have. In that rebuild, you saw it in year 2 under Sark in Texas, where they went 8-5, lost some games they probably shouldn't have lost, but learned how to win, learned how to get a little bit better, and then they burst onto the scene. And it's something that has happened over and over with Matt Rule, whether it's Temple or Baylor. The third year is usually the year they break out. The second year is the build-up year, the year where you see all of the things that need to be in place, but it doesn't necessarily translate to as many wins as you could have hoped. So I think you sit around somewhere around 8-5, 7-6, maybe even 9-4 type team. But this team does have the chance to be even better than those second-year teams under Baylor and Temple just because of the talent level and the little bit of an opening they have in the Big Ten this year. So I'm going to be watching them very closely. This is a team that I think is so fascinating because of the Dylan Raiola factor more than anything else, but also a very good defense that really just needs a little bit of help from their offense. And bringing in someone like Raiola, bringing in the Dante Dowdle in the run game and all the wide receivers they brought in, they've done everything the way that you need to do it. Now, the results on the field need to happen, but the work has been done. Now it's just let the chips fall where they may for Nebraska, and it'll be really, really interesting to watch. But I gotta say, I think they're on the right path. But that will do it for this edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. We are presented by the GSMC Sports Network. Your support means a lot to us, so please remember to subscribe to the show, leave a positive review. It does make a huge difference. Also, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, and more for all the content and updates. Also, I do want to send out a little PSA. I would love to start doing some segments where I take some of your questions about the offseason, some teams you're watching, whatever it is. You can throw anything you want at me, and I am more than happy to include it in a segment, maybe a little interactive type segment on here. You get to see your name on here, so drop any of the comments you want on here, any questions you could possibly need for the upcoming season, because I think that'd be a really fun segment for all of us. So definitely drop any questions you have in the comments here. But thank you once again for listening, and I will see you guys tomorrow.